What's up, Bootcampers? Welcome to today's presentation on interview preparation with DAT Bootcamp. My name is Alex. I'll be your host for this presentation. And in this one, we're going to go through interview preparation, how to prepare for different schools. We're going to go over some common questions, interview day protocols, and everything in between. Let's get into it. So firstly, what is an interview? So an interview is interaction between individuals that gives insight into the interviewee, aka you. Essentially, it's a transaction. You're selling yourself. The way you sort of present yourself, the perceptions that you're able to give off, the answers that you give are all going to determine whether you're going to get into that program or you're not going to get into that program. And remember, an interview is required prior to an acceptance, with the exception of Creighton University that doesn't require an interview for their admission. And remember, an interview done correctly is going to greatly increase your chances of getting accepted into that program. So you really want to prepare well for this, and we're going to get to that in a minute. So first things first, when you're going to be interviewing, there's going to be a lot of different types of interviews. And so dental school programs have a variety of interview types. And so it's sort of important for you to call the school or email them and ask about their interview format. So below, I'm going to give off an overview of what kind of interview formats you can expect to have on interview day. So firstly, there's what's called the open file. This means that essentially your interviewer has access to your full file, your academics, your experiences, your personal statement, your secondary application, etc. A closed file means that they have no access to your file at all, so they don't know any of that information. They don't know your academics, they don't know your personal statement, none of that. Essentially, all they have is what's on your name tag, and that's going to be pretty much your name and maybe the school that you went to besides that. Then there's what's called a semi-closed file. So essentially, this means that they don't have access to your academics, meaning your DAT score or your GPA. They don't have access to that. However, they do have access to all of your soft characteristics, your personal statement, your secondaries, your experiences, and those things. Then there's what's called a traditional interview. And essentially, this is what probably comes to your mind when you think of an interview. It's essentially a one-on-one interview with just you and one interviewer. Then there's what's called a panel interview, where it's you and at least two other interviewers, maybe sometimes three. Then we have what's called the multiple mini interviews. And essentially what this is it has multiple stations with a different question at each station. So how this is going to go about is you're going to read an interview prompt, and it's going to have some sort of a scenario. Sometimes it might be an ethical dilemma or some other scenario. You're going to have about a minute to read it and think of an answer. From there, you're going to go and you're going to introduce yourself to the interviewer, and you're going to have around 5 to 7 minutes to talk about the question. Now, I'll go over MMI interviews in a little bit more detail further on in the presentation, but that's essentially how it is. And you essentially have about, I would say, 6 to 7 stations. Then there's what's called the group interview. So interviewers ask questions openly in front of the group. Essentially, every school has, or most schools have, a combination of a group interview. It's usually very short, where they'll ask you, please tell us your name, where you're from, and maybe an interesting fact about you, and you sort of go in a circle. So it's nothing to be worried about. However, one school that exclusively does group interviews is the University of Southern California, because they follow a problem-based learning curriculum. And so their entire interview is based on a scenario, and you sort of work in a group, and you sort of solve a problem, if you will, and that's the group interview. Lastly, I want to talk about the online and video interview. Now, I only know one school that does this, and that's the University of Detroit Mercy in Michigan State. Essentially, what it is they send you a series of 4 pre-recorded questions, and essentially you're going to have a minute to listen to the question and think of an answer, and you're going to have around, I think it was 45 seconds to respond to those questions, and it's, as I mentioned, 4 questions, and it's sort of an interview prior to your actual interview, and it is still relatively important. I remember when I interviewed at Detroit Mercy, they did bring up one of the answers from my video interview, so keep that in mind. Now I want to talk about the interview timeline, right? So I know a lot of you are probably eager to find out when am I going to get my first interview invites, stuff like that. So remember, dental schools run on different timelines. So some schools may begin interviewing early, and other schools may interview a lot later on in the cycle, and this changes year to year. So the earliest interview invites generally go out around late June for around the early to mid-August time frame. Some schools may not begin interviews all the way until October. This was the case for the previous cycle, where a lot of people were waiting on NYU interviews, and they came out, the first round was about mid-October, if I remember correctly. You can also check to see if anyone has gotten an interview on Student Doctor Network under school-specific discussions. So you can go there and communicate with other people who are interested in that program. And you can see when people get their first interview invites. Generally, people post there, and so you can keep that timeline in your head. It also matters when you submit your application. Obviously, if you haven't submitted your application yet, you're not going to receive an interview invite. So keep that in mind. I sort of talk about this in other presentations, and you can find those on YouTube. So now let's get to the gist of it. How do you begin preparing for the interview? So you got an interview offer. How do you go about things? So I'm going to give you two really good resources for you to use. Firstly, there's what's called the Dental Admissions Guide, and then there's the interview feedback. Both of these resources are found at studentdoctor.net. And so this is the homepage of studentdoctor.net, and you want to go to the SDN resources tab, and you're going to go to either Dental Admissions Guide or the interview feedback. For the purpose of this presentation, we're going to go to the interview feedback, and I'll show you how that works. So we're going to click there on the interview feedback, and it's going to take you to this page here. From here, you're going to select school type as dental school. And then from here, you're going to be able to reference any school in North America. And a lot of people there are going to be posting past questions, which is going to be essential to your interview preparation, because you'll sort of get to see the type of questions that school asks. A lot of times they even recycle questions. So you may get those questions that are already asked. So if you can prepare for that ahead of time, obviously that's going to work well in your favor. So I'm going to let you go ahead and check that out on your own. Now let's get to the interview preparation protocol. So the first thing that you're going to want to do is you're going to want to construct an interview question bank. So what you're going to do is, let's say you got an interview invite at one of the schools. You're going to go to that interview feedback page that I just showed you. You're going to go to the questions, and you're going to see the responses that people gave. And you're going to essentially copy paste those questions into like a Word document or a Google document, whatever. And you're just going to have a whole list of questions. You also want to go to that dental admissions guide that I also mentioned earlier. I wrote a ton of great questions in there, a lot of common questions that you could expect to see at interviews. I also gave a ton of my secrets that I use for interviews to ensure that you sort of maximize your chances. From there on out, so now that you have your interview question bank, we're going to move on to the next step. You want to understand what the interviewer is looking for when they're asking these questions. So some questions may be fairly straightforward, such as why dentistry, and that's pretty straightforward to answer. However, other questions like tell me about your weaknesses is not very straightforward, because if you just go about and answer those straight on and tackle them that way and just give out all of your weaknesses, that's not the best way to go about things. And I'm going to answer this question later on in this presentation. So from there, you're going to write your written response or framework. So I'm really structured. And so when I was constructing my interview question bank, I wrote out exactly what I wanted to say and how I'm going to say it, every single sentence. However, maybe you don't like being so structured, because then you might say your answer won't flow naturally. And so maybe you want to just do bullet points. Either one is fine. Also, be sure to have anecdotes for each of your experiences, because a really common question that they're going to ask is they're going to say, elaborate on X experience that you have on your application. And so it's important to sort of have an answer for every one of those. From there, you're going to get feedback on your answer from your close network. Don't post these questions on SDN or on Facebook groups. And you want to rehearse your responses out loud, because sometimes maybe you wrote out your response and it looks great on paper, and then you try saying it and it doesn't flow, and it just doesn't come out the way you want it to. So always rehearse your responses out loud. I was constantly doing this when I was driving over to interviews, or I would try to rehearse them in my head. So do that. And you also want to have some mock interviews. Invite your friends over, or have like your mom or dad, one of them sort of ask you these questions in your interview booklet and see how you do. That's great practice, probably one of the most important things that you're going to have to do. So now let's go over a few common questions that you can expect on your interview day. So the first question is, why dentistry? This is going to be asked at a large majority of schools. So what answers are they kind of looking for? So you like working with and you're like helping other people. There's a large manual dexterity involvement in dentistry. The fact that dentistry is science-based. Maybe you like the business aspect of dentistry. Maybe you like the leadership position, right? Because they might say like, all right, you like helping people, so why don't you become a dental assistant, or why don't you go into like social work or nursing, something along those lines. And you can say that a dentist is the leader of a team and you enjoy being in a leadership position. Obviously, if that's sort of backed up by your application, you want to say that. And maybe you want to touch upon a professional, personal, work-life balance, although I'll probably not mention this at the interview, but it is another card that you can use. Just be cautious of it. Another common question, as I mentioned, is what are your weaknesses? So there's a right way and a wrong way to answer this question, and I'm going to tell you what the wrong way is first. So the wrong way is to sort of take either flat out just say your weaknesses. That's the wrong way. Another wrong way would be to sort of take a strength and make it look like a weakness. I really hate that approach, simply because one, you're being dishonest, and two, if you don't think your interviewer is smart enough to see through that, that could be pretty insulting to the person on the other side of the table, right? So the way you really want to answer this is, firstly, you want to acknowledge that there's areas in your application that could use some work, right? We all have our own strengths and we all have our own weaknesses, right? I know some people might be very egotistic or whatever, and they might say, I got no weaknesses. That's also not a right way to answer that. You want to show honesty and a desire to improve, right? If you answer it the right way. Because if you can acknowledge that you have weaknesses, then that means you are sort of taking the first step to work on it. And you want to talk about weaknesses that aren't critical to the profession or that are obvious, okay? So for example, one of the weaknesses I could have used when I was interviewing is research experience. I had no research experience on my application. So that could be a weakness, but obviously since I'm already invited for the interview, they oversaw that and they didn't think that that was critical. Another weakness that you could use is maybe public speaking, if you can relate to this. I get nervous in front of large crowds, and I'm sure a lot of other people do. And so maybe the way you phrase this is you say that you get nervous in front of large crowds instead of you getting nervous in social interaction. So make sure that you are wording it properly, and then always end on a positive note. What are you doing to address these weaknesses, right? So for public speaking, when I said this weakness, I would say I took a lot of classes in undergrad towards my upper years where there was a presentation component, and I knew specifically that this class would be challenging because of that presentation component, but it is something that I'm actively working on, I'm trying to improve, and I'm getting better day by day. So something along those lines would be a great answer. Another question is that comes up often is, what sets you apart from other applicants? So here, this question isn't asking, what do you have that no one else has? That's not what it's asking. Essentially, it's asking you to highlight some of your key strengths. So you want to think about what qualities make for a successful dentist and maybe tailor your response to that. So some examples I can give you is leadership, if you have that leadership ability, or if you have a lot of leadership experience. Obviously, if you say leadership, it has to be backed up by your application. So for example, I was in a position of management. I was also the captain of a sports team. And so I could talk about leadership. Time management and prioritization. Well, since you're applying to dental school, I'm assuming your grades are probably pretty good. And so you probably had to balance your academics and you had to balance your some extracurriculars and all that stuff. So definitely want to mention time management and prioritization. Those are very, very important skills to have in dental school. You also maybe want to mention teamwork. If you're a part of like a sports team, as I mentioned earlier, you like working with others. That's going to be crucial to the dental profession. So these are just a few examples. You can obviously come up with your own. Now let's talk about the MMI question, the all famous MMI. A lot of people sort of dread these questions. So first, let's read through this prompt. So this is sort of an example of what you can expect for MMI questions. So C. difficile is a type of bacteria that increases its activity with most antibiotic use and is therefore very difficult to treat. Research shows that the most effective way to prevent the spread of infection is frequent hand washing. However, many people have flat out refused to wash their hands in hospitals. The government is contemplating passing a policy to make it mandatory for people entering hospitals to wash their hands, or else risk not being seen by doctors and being escorted out of the building against their will. Do you think the government should go ahead with this plan? Consider and discuss the legal, ethical, or practical problems that exist for each option, and conclude with a persuasive argument supporting your decision. So essentially, what they're looking for is, can you provide a solution to a problem? Can you acknowledge both sides of the equation? And so what I would recommend is that you pause the video right now and you give it a minute to think about, what would you do in this situation? Would you just refuse care to people? What solutions can you provide? So I'm going to move on to the next slide. So obviously this scenario has many aspects. And remember, there isn't always one correct answer. There could be multiple correct answers. And sometimes there may be, you got to compromise somewhere, right? Obviously we want to provide care to patients, and we do not just want to refuse care to people simply because they didn't wash their hands. So the first thing that came to my mind when I read the scenario was we can provide a different method, such as using hand sanitizer. So those people that don't want to wash their hands, maybe they're okay with using hand sanitizer. And then the interviewer may follow up with something along the lines of hand sanitizer is actually ineffective against C. difficile. Although you aren't expected to know this fact, obviously. However, they could follow up with that. So from then onwards, I could say like, well, okay, if that doesn't work, next thing I could suggest is a quarantine on those patients who are prone to this type of bacteria, which is actually what they do at the hospitals. And it will be unethical to sort of either put these patients in an environment to make them more sick. However, it will also be unethical at the same time to sort of refuse care to patients. So something along those lines where you sort of acknowledge both sides of the equation and you sort of maybe go a little bit more depth into your answer. But that would be a good way to sort of go about things. Now I want to talk about ethical questions, because ethical questions are going to come up fairly often in your interviews, and it is important to sort of understand the basic principles of ethics. You by no means have to be an expert in medical ethics because you are going to be taking those courses in dental school. Nonetheless, you should know some of these definitions and sort of bring up sort of conflicts between ethical principles at your interviews. That's going to show that you are knowledgeable and that you are professional. So firstly, let's talk about autonomy. So autonomy is the respect for patient autonomy, and it refers to respecting the patient's decision and their capacity to make their own decisions. So even though you are a healthcare provider and you're a dentist, You may recommend certain treatment options. It's still up to the patient to make their own decision. Next is beneficence. So this is acting in the patient's best interest, and it's also known as doing good. Then we have non-malfeasance, also known as do no harm. Justice, it refers to the availability of resources and allocating care. And so it's sort of spreading out resources evenly or fairly. Then there's informed consent. So this refers to the ability of an individual to make decisions. So people under 18 generally cannot provide informed consent, or perhaps people that are under the influence of certain drugs, they also may not be able to provide informed consent. So that is something that you want to keep in mind as well. Confidentiality principle. So essentially this means it refers to healthcare professionals respecting the patient's privacy. So essentially you can't be going around telling people the patient's problems or the patient's history, stuff like that. Keep in mind though that there is an exception to this rule. If, for instance, your patient threatens to kill someone, it is still your duty as the healthcare provider to sort of breach this confidentiality principle, and you either have to notify the authorities or you have to notify the person that they are planning to kill. So there's that. So keep that in mind. Lastly, I want to talk about the emancipated minor. So this actually refers to individuals that are younger than 18 who are treated as adults and have the ability to make their own decisions. So what schools can do is they might throw someone who's like 15, 16, or 17 years old, so they're just below what you would consider an adult age, right? They're just below the adult age. And they might throw an example of someone and ask you, can they make a decision? Can they not make a decision? So the moment you see an age range of around like 15 to 17, emancipated minor should pop up in your head. And so an emancipated minor must meet certain criteria, such as financial stability. They have to be living alone and stuff like that. And laws vary between states, so I would recommend maybe you want to do a little bit more research in that. Nonetheless, this is something that's important to keep in mind. So how do you prepare for each school now? So now let's get a little bit more specific. So let's say you got an invite into one school. So the first thing you want to do is you want to have 3 points. I always like to follow the rule of 3. So 3 points of why you want to go to this particular school. You want to research the school via the ADA official guide to dental schools. Use that dental admissions guide that I wrote. I wrote a ton of characteristics about each school. I took you through the whole interview process. You want to look at Student Doctor Network interview feedback, obviously. Sometimes there's some nice info about the school written there. The school's website, definitely you're going to get a lot of info from there. Some school websites are better than others. You definitely want to use journals and newsletters. A lot of people will not be using these, and if you can bring up some information from their journals or the newsletters, you're going to look great for them. You want to also check out their social media platforms, their YouTube page, Facebook page, Instagram, things like that. And you want to make a document of notes about the school. So let me show you what I mean by that. So this is the dental admissions guide that I wrote. And so this is right here on the, let's see what page is this. Page 41 is UOP notes. So essentially when I was interviewing at the University of the Pacific, I made a few notes about the school. And as you can see, I just noted down what I thought were some important characteristics about the school. Things like that, so I could talk about clinical practice, closely resembles private practice. So they follow a private practice model. That's pretty cool. Then there's the PIP program. Students begin working with patients in their second year. So there's just a few notes that I made, and I also here I wrote a few questions that I can ask them during the interview. So you want to create a document that looks just like this when you're going through your interviews. Let me just get back here to this presentation. There we go. And you also want to have follow-up questions. So at the end of every interview, they're going to give you an opportunity to ask questions, and you always want to be asking them at least a few good questions. What I mean by good questions is questions that encourage dialogue, right? So for example, some people may ask, or I heard some people asking, what are the pass rates on the boards? The answer is going to be like 95%, or whatever the answer is going to be. Well, firstly, that's the end of the dialogue right there. So now you're going to ask a new question. And secondly, that doesn't really give you any important information about the school. The pass rate for the boards is high across the board for all schools, so it's not really relevant. And so a better question to ask would be like, what kind of resources do students have when preparing for the boards? At least this encourages a little bit more dialogue, right? It shows a little bit more interest, and it shows a little bit more preparedness. Don't ask any negative questions. I've heard this a few times where people would ask, what are some bad things about the school? This is not comfortable for the interviewer. It also may show that you're not socially calibrated, so keep that in mind and don't ask anything negative. And maybe you want to clarify anything that isn't clear from you, especially if you want to do something like if you're reading the journal or their newsletter, because a lot of people will not be reading those. You might say like, oh, so when I was reading your journal, I noticed this, and this. Can you elaborate a little bit further on that? And that's going to be really good to do because one, it shows your interviewer that you went way farther than the average applicant, and two, you are very knowledgeable about the school, and three, that you're very interested, because if you went that far, then you're obviously very interested in that program. So these are just a few things that you want to keep in mind. And so you want to have about 6 to 10 good questions about the school, because maybe you use 2 in the morning, 2 in the afternoon, and then maybe you're going to need 2 more for your interview. So that way you always have enough good questions to ask the school. And it's okay to open your folder and read your questions. If you have like a long question and you're trying to memorize it, that's okay. You can say, okay, give me a second. You open up your folder and you look at your questions. That's perfectly acceptable. Also, keep in mind that some schools may actually throw a curveball at you, and the first question that they're going to ask you is, do you have any questions for me? So you definitely want to be prepared for this aspect of the interview. Let's talk about booking your interview, right? So you want to try to get back to the school within a day. I would say that's probably the best. Firstly, because a lot of the really good days, so probably like those Mondays or those Fridays, they get filled up pretty quickly. And so if you get back to them quick, you're going to have sort of first dips on the date choices. Then there's what's called the pre-December interviews versus post-December interviews dynamic. So keep in mind that prior to December 1st, schools cannot offer you an admission. However, after December 1st, schools can offer you admission pretty much anytime they please too. And so for pre-December interviews, it's not essentially critical for you to schedule your interview right away or the first date. Sort of schedule it what works for you within a reasonable time frame. Usually schools are going to give you like 3 weeks or 4 weeks of a time frame and say pick a few days from here, or pick a day from here that you want to interview at, and there's your interview date. However, for post-December interviews, you want to try to schedule it as soon as possible, simply because one, there's already a lot of seats taken, and seats get taken in rolling admissions, right? Since now they can pretty much offer offers of admission every week should they please to, right? So you want to schedule your interview invites after December as soon as possible. Obviously, still want to prepare very well, but keep that in mind. Don't delay it for too long. You want to minimize your travel expenses, right? So think about using Uber, think about using Hotwire for hotels, Airbnb, Orbitz for flights. Maybe you can call the school, ask what interview invites or what days for interview invites they have available. And then maybe you want to go back to, like, say, Orbitz and see what the flight prices are for those days, because there might be a dramatic difference between flying in on the Monday and the Friday, and that could save you several $100s. So just keep that in mind. I want to talk a little bit about interview attire. So firstly, what I want to say is, when in doubt, go with the more conservative outfit. So for gentlemen, you're looking at suits that are from the gray to black range. Navy blue is okay as well. As shown here, tie, dress shoes, they look professional here. Remember, you are interviewing for a professional school, so it is important to act the part. When I was interviewing, I saw a few people who had like light blue suits, and those don't look so well. You're not going to a wedding, you are going to dental school. It's a professional school, right? Once again, look and act the part. For ladies, it's a little bit more different, or I guess you have a little bit more options. You can wear pants, you can wear a skirt, blazer, blouse. Those are all okay. I would say that for the skirt, you should probably get one that's a little bit longer than this. For heels, I would say low to moderate heel is acceptable. However, I would probably strongly recommend that you just wear flats, simply because interview tours are pretty lengthy at some schools, and you don't want your feet hurting when you get to the interview or like the next day, something like that. So just wear flats and sort of save yourself the trouble. And once again, when in doubt, just go with the more conservative option and try to avoid very flashy sort of colors. Remember, this is not like you're not rehearsing for a model show or something like that. So what do you bring to your interview? So firstly, you want to check your interview confirmation email to ensure that you have all the appropriate documents, your picture, your personal statement, things like that. Some schools maybe require you to submit a few other forms, so you obviously want to make sure that you filled everything out. Remember, you want to have a copy of your personal statement and your experiences. This happened to someone on DAT Bootcamp's team, Justin. Essentially, what happened to him at Columbia is they mixed his application up with someone else. There was apparently 2 Justin J. Kims. So imagine how prepared he looked when he handed his interviewer a copy of his experiences and his personal statement. So, I mean, obviously, he got into Columbia, so that everything worked out for him. And imagine how prepared he looked. So there's that. You want to invest in a padfolio and a pen, right? So a padfolio is simply just a leather binder. It looks just like this. It's very simple. You can put all of your documents in there. You have a notepad, you keep your pen, pencil, gum, whatever other stuff you need. It's under $30. You can't go wrong. It's very convenient. So instead of bringing like a purse or bringing a briefcase, just invest in a padfolio. It's the best way to go. So the night before, what you want to do is you want to have your interview attire laid out. Make sure you have everything. I remember one time I forgot my belt. So obviously the day before I laid everything out, it was good because I saw, oh, I'm missing my belt. So I just went to Walmart, quickly bought a new belt. So make sure you have everything. Make sure you have your breakfast plan as well. Does your hotel have a breakfast? Are you going to go that route? Maybe the night before you want to go out and maybe buy like a muffin or something along those lines. And that way you have a breakfast plan for the next day. Make sure they have all your documents once again. So check that interview confirmation email. And check the travel time. So especially those big cities, I would say like San Francisco, LA, New York City, those cities have a ton of traffic and a ton of delays. So you always want to account for that. You don't want to stay too far away from the school. Keep that in mind. So maybe if it takes normally 5 minutes, keep in mind that in rush hour, it might take 10 or 15 minutes to get to the school. So you definitely want to be aware of things like that. And you want to also think about taking a sleeping aid. Every night before my interviews, I'll just take a sleeping pill. It helped me sleep, helped me relax, and made sure that I had a good night's rest. The interview day is obviously it's going to be a little bit stressful for you guys. And so it is still important to sort of try to stay calm and get a good rest whenever possible. So on interview day, so what you want to do is you want to arrive about 15 to 20 minutes early and do a walk up and down the block. This is sort of going to help you relax, breathe in the fresh air. Maybe you're going to see other people running to class. Don't go in too early. I'll say about 10 minutes prior to your appointment, up to the time of your appointment is perfectly acceptable. Those are good times to just walk in. Remember to smile and expect to be watched at all times. And this goes in mind with using your manners. Say please and thank you. Hold the door for people, right? You want to be as courteous as possible because you don't know who has a bearing on your outcome, right? And the interview starts the moment you walk on campus until you leave. So you want to leave the best impression possible throughout the entire day. So what's going to happen, the procedure you're going to follow is you're going to walk into the dental school. You're going to be welcomed by program coordinators. They're going to hand you your name tag and an information folder. You're going to walk into a room with the other candidates. So what a tip I can give you here is keep an eye out for the social birds. So some schools, they don't have seating arrangements, others do. So for those that don't, keep an eye out for those social birds. Look towards the people that are engaged in conversation because that's where you want to sit. You definitely don't want to be that person who's in the corner of the room that doesn't talk to anyone. So that's a tip I can give you. Another tip I can give you is check your information folder right away when you receive it or the moment you get a chance to receive it because from there you can look. Some of them may have the names of your interviewers. So perhaps you want to, sometime during the day, you can go to the bathroom, look up what your interviewer does for a living. Maybe they're a periodontist or something like that. And then you can bring that up in the interview. Imagine how prepared you're going to look if you know that stuff, right? Or maybe I know at USC, they had the written prompt in the interview in the information folder. So when I opened it and I saw the question, I had a slight edge over other applicants because I had a little bit more time to sort of think of an answer. You always want to be engaging in conversation. Talk to your fellow candidates or the fellow interviewers and see where they're from, see their story. A lot of them hold very impressive resumes. However, be mindful of your questions and your answers. You definitely don't want to be swearing or using slang too much. You definitely, also another question that people may ask, oh, is this your top choice? I don't care if it's your bottom choice. That day, that school is your top choice. That's the only correct answer you can give. So keep that in mind. And also don't get fazed by other candidates. Some people like to brag, or they might say like, oh, I got a 27 academic average. Oh, I know this person from this school. Oh, I just interviewed at Harvard, or I just interviewed at Penn. And just don't get fazed by other candidates. The school invited you because they want to hear your story. When I was interviewing at Penn, the caliber of applicants was a lot different than other schools. And so obviously I was very impressed, but nonetheless, I still believed in myself. And I got accepted a week later, which is pretty much unheard of at Penn. So there's that. So focus on yourself. Don't get fazed by other candidates. We all have our own strengths and we all have our own weaknesses. So the way I see it, if you're invited to the interview, you have an equal chance of getting into that school as anyone else. So there's that. I also want to talk about thank you letters. So there's two ways to do this. You can either send an email or send a thank you card in the mail. I would probably prefer to send an email simply because if you send a thank you card, it might arrive, let's say 3 or 4 weeks, or maybe it might get lost and then you never sent the thank you card. And I know for a fact that some schools are going to attach your thank you note to your file. So you definitely want to be writing these. If you want to go the handwritten route, maybe you want to bring the thank you card ahead of time. And then that way, before you leave the school, you can sort of fill it out quickly. And when you're writing it, you want to say, thank you for interviewing me, what you liked about the program, reiterate your interest once again, keep it to about a paragraph and include your name and your ADSAS ID simply because, as I mentioned, some schools do like to link your thank you card to your file. So those are just some tips that I can give you about that. So thank you very much for listening to this presentation from all of us here at DAT Bootcamp. Be sure to follow us on all of our social media platforms. We've got a ton of great content, a ton of resources for you guys to use to sort of maximize your success in the application cycle. Have a good one.